They called her a library aide who couldn't handle anything more challenging than checking out romance novels. What they didn't know was that Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez had once been the Army's most decorated combat medic, and she was about to prove that the most dangerous warriors sometimes hide behind the quietest smiles. The soft hum of fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow across the cramped reference section of the Millbrook Public Library, where dust motes danced lazily in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall windows. Elena Vasquez adjusted her wire-rimmed reading glasses and continued cataloging returned books, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the scanner. The name tag pinned to her beige cardigan read Elena, Reference Assistant, a title that had become her shield for the past 14 months. At 31, Elena had traded her desert combat boots for comfortable flats, her tactical vest for soar cardigans in muted colors, and her call sign, Guardian Angel, for a library card number. The transformation had been deliberate, a conscious choice to disappear into the mundane world of overdue fines and research requests. Here, surrounded by towering shelves of forgotten knowledge and the gentle whisper of turning pages, she found a peace that had eluded her since that terrible night in Kandahar. The morning routine never varied. Arrive at 8:30, brew coffee in the small break room, and begin the day's work of helping patrons locate information they needed. Elena's desk occupied a corner position in the main reading room, perfectly positioned to observe the comings and goings of library visitors while maintaining the low profile she desperately needed. Through the large windows, she could see the flag flying at half-staff in the town square, a sight that still caused her chest to tighten with memories she worked hard to suppress. The other library employees treated Elena with the casual politeness reserved for reliable but unremarkable colleagues. Margaret Chun, the head librarian, appreciated her efficiency and attention to detail, often commenting on how refreshing it was to have someone who could handle complex research requests without constant supervision. Tom Bradley, the maintenance supervisor, occasionally asked for help organizing supply closets, and Sandra Mills, the children's librarian, would sometimes invite her to join the staff for lunch at the local diner. For the most part, Elena existed in a bubble of professional invisibility, exactly as she preferred. The library patrons saw only what they expected to see, a quiet woman in her 30s who knew how to navigate the Dewey Decimal System and could locate obscure historical documents with impressive speed. They noticed her neat handwriting on reference cards, her patient explanations of database searches, and her ability to remain calm when dealing with difficult customers. What they didn't notice were the subtle signs that marked her as something far more dangerous than a reference librarian. Her posture, even while seated at her desk, maintained the alert readiness of someone trained for combat situations. Her eyes constantly scanned the room, automatically cataloging exits and potential threats with the unconscious awareness of a soldier who had learned that relaxation could mean death. When emergency vehicles passed by with sirens wailing, she would pause in her work, her head tilting slightly as she identified the type of response and calculated the probable nature of the emergency. Hey everyone, welcome to our channel. We're so excited to have you here with us today. If you're enjoying our content, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps us out. Share this video with your friends who might love it too. Your support means everything to us and keeps us motivated to create more amazing content for you. Thanks for being part of our awesome community. Now let's jump right into today's video. The scars were there too, hidden beneath carefully applied makeup and long sleeves, but visible to anyone who knew how to look. A thin white line along her left forearm where shrapnel had torn through her uniform during a rocket attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman. Slight discoloration on her right temple from a head injury sustained when an IED exploded 20 meters from her position while she was treating wounded civilians. the barely perceptible tremor in her hands during thunderstorms, a reminder of the night she had worked for 18 straight hours treating casualties from a massive Taliban offensive. Elena's apartment reflected the same deliberate ordinariness as her work persona. Generic furniture from discount stores, neutral colors that could belong to any single woman trying to stretch a modest salary, and minimal personal touches that revealed nothing about her past. The walls were decorated with mass-produced prints of flowers and landscapes, the kind of art that filled space without making statements or triggering memories. But hidden in the bedroom closet, sealed in a waterproof container, lay the artifacts of her previous life. Combat medic insignia, commendation ribbons, and photographs with unit members whose names she rarely allowed herself to remember. The silver star she had never displayed, earned for actions during the Battle of Marja when she had single-handedly evacuated 12 wounded soldiers under heavy enemy fire. The Purple Heart that reminded her of the day she had been wounded while shielding a critically injured Afghan child from sniper fire. The transition to civilian life had been an adjustment that took months to navigate. Learning to sleep through the night without listening for incoming mortar rounds or the sound of helicopters bringing in casualties. Shopping for groceries without calculating supply requirements for a forward aid station. Making small talk with neighbors who had never experienced the weight of life and death. Decisions are the brotherhood forged in combat zones, but the hardest part had been the silence. In the field, every moment was filled with radio chatter, helicopter rotors, and the constant awareness that someone's life might depend on her next decision. The library, by contrast, was a sanctuary of whispered conversations and muffled footsteps. Sometimes the quiet was so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat, counting the seconds between breaths like she once counted the seconds between artillery strikes. The choice to work at Millbrook Public Library had been strategic. Town was large enough for her to remain anonymous, but small enough that she could feel connected to a community without the overwhelming complexity of urban life. She could see the American flag that flew over the town square, hear the national anthem played at high school football games, and maintain some thread of connection to the identity she had chosen to abandon. It was a compromise between complete isolation and the painful process of reintegration that so many veterans struggled with. Elena's supervisor, Margaret Chun, was a career librarian who had worked in public service for over 20 years. She appreciated Elena's efficiency and dedication, often mentioning how remarkable it was to have someone who could handle difficult research requests and maintain composure under pressure. Margaret had no idea that Elena's familiarity with crisis management came from years of treating combat casualties under the most extreme conditions rather than library science training. The other staff members viewed Elena as competent but unremarkable. She arrived on time, completed her assignments without complaint, and participated in staff meetings just enough to avoid seeming antisocial. During breaks, she would often eat lunch alone while reading paperback novels or working crossword puzzles, content to blend into the background of small-town life. The irony wasn't lost on Elena that she now helped people locate information about medical procedures and emergency response protocols, subjects she knew more about than most practicing physicians. Her fingers would trace the medical references in textbooks, remembering the weight of trauma shears and the sound of helicopter blades bringing in casualties. She knew the symptoms of shock, the proper treatment for sucking chest wounds, and the exact pressure points needed to stop arterial bleeding. But that knowledge remained locked away behind her carefully constructed facade of mild-mannered librarian. Occasionally, particularly when helping patrons with medical research or dealing with minor emergencies in the library, Elena would catch herself slipping into the clinical mindset that had once saved dozens of lives. She would analyze symptoms with the same intensity she had once applied to triage decisions, or identify potential medical emergencies with the diagnostic skills that had kept her alive during the most dangerous missions. But those moments were rare. quickly suppressed before anyone could notice the transformation. Elena had worked too hard to build her new identity, to risk exposure through careless behavior. The librarian persona was her refuge, her protection, from a world that had demanded too much and given too little in return. The morning sun streamed through the library windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like the helicopters that still appeared in her dreams. Elena continued her work, processing another day's worth of reference requests while carefully maintaining the invisible barriers that separated her past from her present. She was exactly where she wanted to be, hidden in plain sight, safe from the expectations and responsibilities that had once defined her existence. The official records showed that Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez had been killed in action during a Taliban offensive in the Kandahar province of Afghanistan. Her dog tags had been returned to her family in a solemn ceremony attended by military officials and local dignitaries. Her name was engraved on the wall of a veteran's memorial, and her parents had received a folded flag in recognition of their daughter's ultimate sacrifice. But Elena Vasquez was very much alive, living quietly, in a small town where nobody knew her real name or understood the true extent of her capabilities. She had chosen anonymity over recognition, silence over acknowledgement, and civilian life over the military glory that had once defined her existence. In a few hours, everything would change. The carefully constructed world of reference books and quiet research would be shattered by the kind of crisis that demanded split-second medical decisions and the courage to act when others froze. The librarian would be forced to remember what it meant to be a combat medic, and the woman who had once been declared dead would discover that some battles can only be won by those who refuse to stay buried. The truth about Elena Vasquez was buried in classified files so deep within Pentagon databases that only a handful of individuals with the highest security clearances could access them. Her real story began 3 years earlier in the blood-soaked mountains of Afghanistan's Kandahar province, where she had earned a reputation as one of the most skilled and fearless combat medics in the history of the United States Army. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, callsign Guardian Angel, had been assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, operating out of Firebase Restrepo in the Korengal Valley. The assignment was considered a death sentence by most military personnel, as the valley was known as one of the most dangerous places on Earth for American forces. Taliban fighters controlled the high ground, and every patrol faced the certainty of contact with enemy forces determined to kill or capture American soldiers. Elena's medical training had been extensive, far beyond what most combat medics received. She had completed advanced trauma courses at the Army Medical Department Center and School, specialized in battlefield surgical procedures that could be performed under fire, and trained with special operations forces who required medical support in the most hostile environments. Her instructors had noted her exceptional ability to remain calm under extreme stress, her intuitive understanding of human anatomy, and her remarkable skill at performing complex medical procedures with minimal equipment. The selection process for assignment to the Korengal Valley had been brutal, with only the most capable and psychologically resilient personnel chosen for deployment to what military planners privately called the meat grinder. Elena had volunteered for the assignment, driven by a combination of professional pride and personal conviction that American soldiers deserved the best possible medical care, regardless of how dangerous the environment. Her initial deployment had been marked by a series of increasingly difficult missions that tested her medical skills and combat readiness. The Taliban forces in the valley were sophisticated and well-equipped, employing tactics that maximized American casualties while minimizing their own exposure. Roadside bombs, sniper attacks, and coordinated assaults on forward operating bases created a constant stream of wounded soldiers who required immediate medical attention. Elena's reputation as Guardian Angel had been earned during her first month in the valley, when she had successfully treated 17 wounded soldiers. during a 12-hour firefight that had nearly overrun their position. Working in complete darkness under heavy enemy fire, she had performed emergency surgery using only a headlamp and basic medical supplies, saving the lives of men who would have died without her intervention. The psychological profiles in Elena's classified files revealed a soldier who thrived under extreme pressure, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain focused during chaotic combat situations, and who could make complex medical decisions with remarkable speed and accuracy. Her unit commanders had noted that she seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of battlefield medicine that couldn't be taught through conventional training methods. Her technical knowledge extended far beyond basic combat medic training. Elena had studied advanced emergency medicine, trauma surgery, and battlefield anesthesia with the same intensity that she applied to combat operations. She could diagnose complex injuries by touch alone, calculate drug dosages in her head while under fire, and perform surgical procedures that exceeded the capabilities of most civilian emergency room physicians at the awards and commendations. In Elena's file told the story of a medic who had consistently exceeded every expectation and saved lives under impossible conditions. She had received the Combat Medical Badge, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and the Army Commendation Medal for her actions during numerous firefights. Her Silver Star had been earned during the Battle of Marja, where she had single-handedly evacuated 12 wounded soldiers while under continuous enemy fire. The mission that would change everything had begun as a routine patrol in the Peck River Valley, an area that had been relatively quiet for several weeks. Elena's unit had been tasked with conducting a presence patrol, showing the flag in villages that had been infiltrated by Taliban forces and gathering intelligence about enemy activities in the region. The patrol had consisted of 24 soldiers, including Elena as the primary medic, traveling in 6 armored vehicles through terrain that offered countless opportunities for enemy ambush. The intelligence briefing had indicated minimal enemy activity in the area, with local Afghan forces reporting that Taliban fighters had withdrawn to more remote locations. Elena's medical kit had been loaded with supplies for treating routine injuries and minor combat wounds, the standard loadout for a patrol that wasn't expected to encounter significant enemy resistance. Her personal equipment included her M4 carbine, body armor, and the advanced medical supplies that she had requisitioned for treating more serious casualties. The ambush had been perfectly executed, with Taliban fighters positioned on the high ground overlooking a narrow valley where the American patrol was forced to travel in single file. The initial attack had consisted of rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine gun fire that had disabled 3 of the 6 vehicles and wounded 8 soldiers in the first 30 seconds of contact. Elena's response had been immediate and instinctive. She had jumped from her vehicle while it was still moving, her medical bag in one hand and her rifle in the other, running toward the nearest group of wounded soldiers while bullets impacted the ground around her feet. The training that had prepared her for this moment took over completely, and she moved with the precision and confidence of someone who had rehearsed these actions countless times. The casualties were severe, with multiple soldiers suffering from shrapnel wounds, broken bones, and traumatic injuries that required immediate medical attention. Elena's triage assessment had been rapid and accurate, identifying the most critically wounded soldiers and beginning treatment while the firefight continued around her. Working under fire, she had performed emergency surgery on a soldier whose femoral artery had been severed by shrapnel, using her body to shield him from incoming bullets while she worked to stop the bleeding. The procedure had required her to reach inside the wound with her bare hands, locating the damaged artery and applying direct pressure, while simultaneously calling for helicopter evacuation. The firefight had continued for over 6 hours, with Elena moving constantly between wounded soldiers, treating injuries that ranged from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. She had used every piece of medical equipment in her kit, improvising surgical instruments from battlefield debris and using her own uniform to create pressure bandages for wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. The Taliban fighters had been determined to prevent the evacuation of American casualties, directing concentrated fire at Elena every time she moved between wounded soldiers. Her survival had depended on her ability to read the rhythm of the battle, anticipating enemy movements and using terrain features to mask her approach to wounded soldiers. Elena's most heroic actions had come during the final phase of the battle, when she had realized that 3 critically wounded soldiers were trapped in a disabled vehicle that was taking direct fire from enemy forces. The vehicle's position made it impossible for other soldiers to reach the casualties, and the wounded men were slowly bleeding to death while unable to move to safety. Elena's decision to attempt a rescue had been made against direct orders from her unit commander, who had determined that the risk was too great to justify the attempt. But Elena had heard the voices of the wounded soldiers over the radio, their calls for help growing weaker as their injuries worsened, and she had been unable to abandon men who were counting on her for survival. The rescue had required Elena to cross 50 meters of open ground while under direct observation by enemy snipers, carrying medical supplies and equipment that would be needed to treat the wounded soldiers. She had used smoke grenades to mask her approach, timing her movements to coincide with friendly fire that would suppress enemy positions. The treatment of the wounded soldiers had been performed inside the disabled vehicle while enemy bullets shattered the windows and penetrated the armor plating. Elena had worked in complete darkness, using her hands to assess injuries and perform procedures that required the steadiest possible technique. The men she was treating had been critically wounded, with injuries that would have challenged the capabilities of a fully equipped hospital emergency room. Elena's medical expertise had enabled her to stabilize all 3 soldiers, performing emergency surgery with improvised instruments while bullets impacted the vehicle around her. She had successfully stopped internal bleeding, stabilized fractures, and treated traumatic injuries that would have been fatal without immediate intervention. The evacuation had been the most dangerous phase of the rescue, requiring Elena to move 3 wounded soldiers across open ground to a landing zone where helicopters could extract them safely. The movement had been conducted under heavy enemy fire, with Elena making multiple trips to carry men who were too wounded to move under their own power. The final casualty report from the engagement had listed 3 American soldiers killed in action and 15 wounded, with Elena's actions credited with saving the lives of 8 men who would have died without her intervention. The battle had become legendary within military medical circles, with Elena's performance setting new standards for battlefield medicine and combat heroism. But the psychological cost of the mission had been enormous. Elena's medical records following the engagement had documented symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress, including recurring nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness that had developed after treating so many wounded soldiers under extreme conditions. The weight of responsibility for lives that had been saved or lost had begun to affect her ability to function normally. The breaking point had come 2 weeks later, during a mission that had required Elena to treat Afghan civilians who had been wounded in a Taliban attack on their village. The casualties had included women and children whose injuries were so severe that Elena's medical supplies had been insufficient to treat them all effectively. Elena had been forced to make triage decisions about which civilians would receive treatment and which would be left to die, knowing that her limited medical resources could only save some of the wounded. The psychological impact of choosing who would live and who would die had shattered her emotional defenses, leaving her unable to continue functioning as a combat medic. Her decision to leave military service had been complicated by her exceptional value to the Army Medical Department and the classified nature of many of her missions. Elena's skills and experience were considered irreplaceable, and her departure would create a gap in military medical capabilities that would be difficult to fill. The solution had been a complex arrangement involving the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, and several other agencies whose involvement was itself classified. Elena's death had been staged during a Taliban attack on her forward operating base, with her body reportedly destroyed by an explosion that had also killed 3 other soldiers. The deception had been so complete that Elena's own family had been convinced of her death, receiving her personal effects and attending a funeral service where an empty casket had been buried with full military honors. The grief and trauma that her parents had experienced had been real, even though their daughter was alive and beginning a new life under a different identity. Elena's transition to civilian life had been carefully managed by a team of psychologists and intelligence officers who understood the unique challenges faced by soldiers with her background and capabilities. The small town of Millbrook had been selected as her new home because it was large enough to provide anonymity, while small enough to offer the sense of community that she needed for psychological healing. The library position had been arranged through a complex network of connections that ensured Elena would have meaningful work while maintaining the low profile that was essential for her safety and psychological well-being. Her supervisor and colleagues had no idea that their quiet reference librarian had once been one of the most decorated combat medics in military history. Elena's apartment had been carefully prepared to provide the stability and normalcy that she needed while ensuring that nothing would reveal her true identity. The generic furniture and neutral decorations had been selected to create an environment that was completely divorced from her military past, allowing her to begin the process of psychological recovery. The classified files that documented Elena's true story would remain sealed indefinitely, protecting both her identity and the operational details of missions that were still considered sensitive. Only a handful of people knew that the woman who had died heroically in Afghanistan was actually alive and working in a small-town library, processing overdue books and answering research questions. Elena's commitment to her new identity had been absolute, but the skills and instincts that had once made her a legendary combat medic remained just beneath the surface of her carefully constructed civilian persona. The quiet librarian who helped patrons locate information was still the warrior who had saved lives under impossible conditions, and the woman who had chosen anonymity over recognition was still capable of actions that could change the course of events. The pattern began subtly, like most institutional harassment does. Dr. Vincent Carradine's first direct interaction with Elena came during a routine board meeting at the Millbrook Public Library 3 months after her arrival. The newly appointed library director had been reviewing staff performance reports when he noticed her name appearing frequently in connection with complex research requests and patron satisfaction surveys. "Miss Vasquez," he had said, approaching her desk with the measured stride of someone accustomed to academic authority. "I see your name on numerous research assistance reports. You seem to be handling inquiries that typically require graduate-level expertise." His tone carried the dismissive edge that Elena recognized immediately from her interactions with certain officers who had questioned her medical decisions in the field. "Just helping patrons find the information they need, sir. Research coordination requires understanding how different sources connect to each other." Elena's response had been delivered with the same steady calm that had once unnerved Taliban fighters during medical evacuations under fire. Dr. Carradine's eyebrows had risen slightly at her confident response. "Research coordination. That's an interesting way to phrase it. I'm sure the patrons appreciate your enthusiasm, but we must remember that library science requires formal training and proper academic credentials." Elena had met his gaze with the unwavering focus that had once helped her perform surgery while under enemy fire, but she had said nothing further. That first encounter established the foundation for everything that would follow. Dr. Carradine had arrived at Millbrook with a Ph.D. in library science from Columbia University and 15 years of experience in academic libraries. His vision for the public library emphasized traditional hierarchies, formal procedures, and the importance of maintaining clear distinctions between professional librarians and support staff. Elena's obvious competence and the respect she had, earned from both colleagues and patrons, represented a challenge to his authority that he found increasingly difficult to ignore. During his previous positions at university libraries, he had worked exclusively with credentialed professionals who understood their roles within established academic hierarchies. The idea that a reference assistant without formal library science training could handle complex research requests seemed to undermine the very foundations of his professional identity. Dr. Carradine's campaign of professional diminishment accelerated during the quarterly staff evaluation process. Elena's supervisor, Margaret Chun, had prepared a comprehensive review highlighting her exceptional performance, her ability to handle difficult research requests, and her remarkable skill at calming frustrated patrons during stressful situations. The evaluation had included specific examples of complex historical research projects that Elena had completed, and testimonials from community members who had praised her expertise. When the evaluation reached Dr. Carradine's desk, he had summoned Margaret for a private meeting in his office. The discussion had been framed as a concern about proper role boundaries and the importance of maintaining professional standards within the library system. "I'm concerned about Miss Vasquez," he had told Margaret, his voice carrying the weight of academic authority. "Her involvement in complex research projects seems excessive for someone in her position. We need to ensure that support staff understand their appropriate responsibilities and don't attempt to perform duties that require professional library training." Margaret had attempted to defend Elena's performance, citing specific examples of problems solved and satisfied patrons, but Dr. Carradine's response had been swift and decisive. "I appreciate her dedication, but we must maintain proper professional boundaries. Library science requires specific training and credentials that ensure quality service. I want her assignments reviewed to ensure they align with support staff capabilities." The immediate result had been a systematic reduction in Elena's responsibilities and authority within the library. Complex research requests that had previously been assigned to her were redirected to staff members with formal library science degrees. Her access to specialized databases and research tools was quietly restricted, justified through new policies that emphasized the importance of professional oversight for sensitive information requests. Elena recognized the tactics being employed against her immediately. She had witnessed similar campaigns during her military service, seen how institutional power could be weaponized against individuals who threatened established hierarchies or challenged the assumptions of insecure leaders. But her response was characteristic of the discipline that had once made her legendary among combat medics. She absorbed the restrictions without complaint, adapted to her reduced responsibilities, and continued performing her assigned duties with the same precision that had once characterized her medical work under fire. Dr. Carradine's satisfaction with these changes was evident in his subsequent interactions with Elena. He would pause at her desk during his weekly tours of the library, making pointed comments about the importance of staying within appropriate professional boundaries and focusing on tasks that matched one's training and credentials. "Miss Vasquez," he would say, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by nearby staff members, "I trust you're finding your refined duties more manageable. It's important that all staff members work within their areas of expertise and training." Elena's responses were invariably professional and measured. "Yes, sir. I'm focused on my assigned responsibilities." But those who knew how to read body language might have noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers would pause over her keyboard for just a moment too long, the barely perceptible tightening around her eyes that suggested depths of experience and capability that her current role couldn't contain. Dr. Carradine's confidence in his approach was reinforced by the apparent success of his intervention. Elena's name disappeared from reports involving complex research projects. Her supervisor stopped mentioning her contributions to challenging patron requests. The library continued functioning efficiently, but without the troublesome boundary crossing that had concerned him. However, the director's campaign didn't stop with professional restrictions. His comments about Elena began to carry increasingly personal undertones, subtle references to her background and qualifications that were designed to reinforce her subordinate status within the library hierarchy. During a staff meeting about budget constraints and service priorities, he had made pointed remarks about the importance of ensuring that all personnel understood their limitations and worked within their documented capabilities. "We have dedicated support staff who handle important routine functions," he had announced to the assembled group. "But we must remember that professional library service requires specific training and credentials. Good intentions and enthusiasm cannot substitute for proper education and proven competence." The statement had been carefully crafted to sound like general administrative guidance, but everyone present understood its specific target. Elena had sat in the back of the meeting room, her expression unchanged while colleagues glanced in her direction with varying degrees of sympathy and discomfort. The message was clear: know your place, stay within your assigned role, and don't aspire to responsibilities that require professional credentials. The harassment escalated during the library's annual community outreach program, a comprehensive initiative that involved coordinating with local schools, senior centers, and community organizations to provide specialized research and educational services. Elena's previous involvement in such programs had been extensive, drawing on her ability to work with diverse populations and her skill at explaining complex information in accessible ways. But under the new restrictions, her role was limited to basic administrative support and routine clerical tasks. Dr. Carradine made a point of visiting the program coordination area during peak activity periods, when the complexity of the work and the importance of professional expertise were most evident. "Working late again, Miss Vasquez," he had observed during one such visit, his tone suggesting that extended hours were somehow inappropriate for someone in her position. "I hope you're not taking on responsibilities that exceed your training. We wouldn't want any confusion about professional boundaries during such an important community program." Elena had looked up from her computer terminal, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that momentarily unsettled him. "Just completing my assigned tasks, sir. Making sure the administrative support is thorough and accurate." The director's smile had been thin and condescending. "Administrative support? Yes, that's exactly right. That's what support staff do. They provide administrative assistance to the professional librarians who handle the complex work. It's important that everyone understands their proper role in serving the community." The exchange had been witnessed by several library staff members who were working nearby, and their reactions revealed the growing discomfort with Dr. Carradine's treatment of Elena. Some avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the obvious unfairness, but unwilling to challenge their supervisor. Others watched with barely concealed disapproval, recognizing that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. Margaret Chun, who had observed many of these interactions, began to feel increasingly uneasy about the director's fixation on Elena's work and capabilities. During private conversations in her office, she had attempted to redirect his attention to other administrative matters, but Dr. Carradine seemed unable to let go of his concerns about what he perceived as inappropriate professional behavior. "There's something about her that bothers me," the director had confided to Margaret during one of their regular supervisory meetings. "She acts like she has expertise that goes beyond her training and position. She handles complex situations with a confidence that seems inconsistent with her background. I can't specify exactly what's wrong, but something doesn't align with what I expect from support staff." Margaret, had nodded diplomatically while privately wondering if the director's concerns were more about his own insecurities than Elena's actual performance. She had worked with Elena daily for over a year and found her to be professional, competent, and appropriately respectful of library hierarchies. If anything, Elena seemed almost overqualified for her current position, but that hardly seemed like grounds for the sustained scrutiny she was receiving. The director's suspicions were fed by his fundamental misunderstanding of Elena's background and capabilities. He interpreted her quiet confidence as presumption, her professional competence as role confusion, and her occasional flashes of deeper knowledge as evidence of inappropriate ambition. His worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility that a reference assistant might possess expertise that exceeded his own, so he constructed alternative explanations that preserved his assumptions about credentials and professional hierarchies. The harassment began to affect Elena's daily routine in ways that were both subtle and significant. Her access to certain areas of the library was restricted, justified by new security protocols that seemed to apply primarily to her position. Her parking privileges were modified, forcing her to walk additional distances in all weather conditions. Her work schedule was adjusted to limit her interaction with patrons during peak research periods when her expertise would be most valuable. These changes were implemented gradually and justified through various administrative mechanisms, making them difficult to challenge directly. Elena understood the tactics being employed against her, recognized the systematic nature of the campaign, and began to document each incident with the methodical precision that had once characterized her medical record-keeping in combat zones. Her apartment became a repository for carefully organized evidence of the harassment she was experiencing. Time-stamped emails, witness statements, and detailed records of policy changes that seemed designed to target her specifically. Elena had learned during her military career that institutional power could be challenged, but only through careful preparation and overwhelming documentation. Dr. Carradine's confidence in his approach was bolstered by the apparent success of his campaign. Elena's visibility within the library had been reduced, her influence curtailed, and her role properly defined within the boundaries he considered appropriate. The library continued functioning efficiently, but without the troublesome boundary crossing that had concerned him. The director's daily routine included reviews of staff productivity reports and patron satisfaction surveys, documents that increasingly reflected the impact of his restrictions on Elena's work. Her name appeared less frequently in connection with complex research projects, and her supervisor's evaluations began to emphasize routine, administrative tasks rather than specialized expertise. Elena's response to the escalating harassment was characteristic of the mental discipline that had once enabled her to function effectively under extreme combat stress. She absorbed each slight and restriction without outward reaction, continued performing her duties with unwavering professionalism, and maintained the calm demeanor that had once helped her save lives while under enemy fire. But beneath the surface of her carefully controlled exterior, Elena was conducting her own systematic analysis of Dr. Carradine's behavior and motivations. Her training in tactical assessment and threat evaluation was being applied to understand the psychology of her antagonist and identify potential vulnerabilities in his approach. The director's campaign of professional diminishment was being documented by someone whose experience with hostile environments had taught her to recognize patterns, anticipate escalation, and prepare for the moment when defensive measures would no longer be sufficient. Elena's patience with his harassment was not weakness, but strategy. The same emotional control that had kept her alive through countless medical emergencies was now being applied to a different kind of battlefield. Dr. Carradine had no way of knowing that his systematic campaign against a reference assistant was actually being conducted against someone whose training and experience in crisis management far exceeded his own. The quiet librarian who processed his restrictions without complaint was simultaneously gathering intelligence about his methods and preparing for the inevitable moment when her true capabilities would be revealed. What the director didn't understand was that he was systematically dismantling the defenses of someone who had once been responsible for keeping soldiers alive under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Every restriction he imposed, every slight he delivered, and every attempt to diminish her authority was being catalogued by a mind trained to assess threats, identify weaknesses, and respond with precision when the situation demanded action. The reference assistant was documenting everything, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone what it meant to underestimate someone who had learned to save lives while others were trying to take them. Dr. Carradine's campaign of harassment was about to collide with capabilities and experience that existed far beyond his understanding or preparation. The morning of October 12th began like any other at Millbrook Public Library, with Elena arriving at her desk precisely at 8:30 to begin processing the routine research requests that had become her carefully circumscribed daily existence. The overnight returns indicated normal activity, standard reference inquiries, and the usual administrative requirements that kept the library functioning smoothly. But beneath the surface of this ordinary Thursday, tensions were building that would soon explode into a crisis that would test every person in the building. Elena had been working for approximately 90 minutes when the first signs of trouble appeared on her computer screen. A series of urgent messages from the County Emergency Management Office had been forwarded to all municipal buildings, including the library. The alerts indicated that a major industrial accident had occurred at the Millbrook chemical processing plant, located just 3 miles from the town center. Initial reports suggested that a containment breach had released toxic gases into the surrounding area, potentially affecting thousands of residents. The emergency notification system had been activated, directing all public buildings to prepare for possible evacuation procedures, while emergency responders assessed the scope of the contamination. Elena's administrative role included monitoring such alerts and coordinating with library staff to ensure patron safety during emergency situations. It was routine work that she had performed several times during severe weather events, but this particular morning, she noticed details in the emergency reports that immediately triggered her analytical instincts. The chemical compounds mentioned in the hazmat reports were substances that Elena recognized from her military training in battlefield medicine and chemical weapon response. Her experience treating soldiers exposed to various toxic agents had given her extensive knowledge of chemical contamination symptoms, treatment protocols, and the critical timing factors that determined whether exposure would be fatal or survivable. The initial reports described symptoms among plant workers that Elena immediately recognized as consistent with organophosphate poisoning, a condition that required immediate medical intervention, with specific antidotes that were not commonly available in civilian medical facilities. Her knowledge of toxicology and emergency medicine told her that the affected individuals had perhaps 30 minutes to receive proper treatment before the poisoning would become irreversible. Elena's first instinct was to document these concerns and contact emergency medical services to ensure they were aware of the specific treatment requirements for this type of chemical exposure. Her experience in combat zones had taught her that civilian medical personnel often lacked training in treating chemical casualties, and the difference between life and death frequently depended on having the right medical supplies and knowledge immediately available. But when Elena attempted to access the emergency coordination databases that would allow her to communicate directly with medical responders, she discovered that her clearance had been further restricted following Dr. Carradine's latest round of professional limitations. The access codes that had worked just days earlier were now invalid, and her attempts to contact emergency services were blocked by security protocols that required supervisor approval for any communication with external agencies. Elena's frustration was compounded by the knowledge that her assessment of the chemical exposure was based on expertise that she couldn't reveal without exposing her true background. The symptoms she had identified would have been obvious to anyone with advanced training in chemical casualties and emergency medicine, but explaining how a reference librarian had developed such specialized knowledge would raise questions that she wasn't prepared to answer. Her attempts to bring these concerns to Margaret Chen were met with responses that reflected the reduced credibility that Dr. Carradine's campaign had achieved. Margaret, who had once valued Elena's insights and analytical abilities, now seemed to view her concerns as evidence of the role confusion that the director had warned about. "Elena, I appreciate your attention to detail," Margaret had said during their brief meeting, "but emergency response is handled by trained professionals who have the proper equipment and expertise. We need to focus on our library responsibilities, rather than trying to second-guess the emergency management officials who are trained for these situations." The rejection of her concerns left Elena in an impossible position. Her instincts, trained through years of treating chemical casualties in combat zones, were screaming that the emergency response was inadequate and that people were going to die without proper medical intervention. But her current role as a reference assistant provided no legitimate avenue for acting on her knowledge without revealing capabilities that would shatter her carefully constructed anonymity. Elena's decision to conduct her own investigation was driven by a combination of professional duty and growing certainty that the chemical exposure represented a far greater threat than local emergency services were prepared to handle. She began using her limited access to trace the origins of the contamination, working within the constraints of her restricted clearance levels to gather whatever information was available through standard databases and news reports. Investigation required Elena to employ skills that she had developed during her military service, analyzing symptom patterns, tracing chemical supply chains, and identifying potential complications that civilian medical personnel might not recognize. Her approach was methodical and systematic, designed to build a comprehensive picture of what appeared to be a chemical emergency that was being severely mismanaged by local authorities. Working discreetly at her desk while maintaining the appearance of routine library duties, Elena discovered that the chemical release was far more serious than initial reports had indicated. The compounds involved were industrial-grade organophosphates that had been stored in quantities sufficient to contaminate a much larger area than emergency services had calculated. The wind patterns and atmospheric conditions were carrying the toxic plume directly toward the elementary school and senior center, both located downwind from the processing plant. The most disturbing aspect of Elena's investigation was the discovery that the emergency medical response was completely inadequate for treating organophosphate poisoning. The local hospital had limited supplies of atropine and pralidoxime, the specific antidotes required for this type of chemical exposure. The ambulance crews had been given standard hazmat protocols that were designed for general chemical spills rather than the specific life-threatening emergency they were actually facing. Elena's knowledge of chemical casualty treatment told her that without immediate intervention, the affected individuals would begin experiencing respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, and neurological damage within the next hour. The children at the elementary school were particularly vulnerable, as their smaller body weights meant that even minimal exposure could be fatal without proper medical treatment. Her attempts to escalate these concerns through official channels were systematically blocked by the restrictions that Dr. Carradine had imposed on her access and authority. The emergency coordination personnel who should have been investigating these issues were either unavailable or unwilling to take seriously the concerns of a library reference assistant whose credibility had been systematically undermined. Elena's growing desperation led her to consider options that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. She began to contemplate actions that would require revealing aspects of her true background and capabilities, knowing that such exposure would end the anonymous existence she had worked so hard to maintain. The conflict between her commitment to safety, and her need for privacy was becoming increasingly impossible to resolve. Hey, everyone. Welcome to our channel. We're so excited to have you here with us today. If you're enjoying our content, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps us out. Share this video with your friends who might love it too. Your support means everything to us and keeps us motivated to create more amazing content for you. Thanks for being part of our awesome community. Now, let's jump right into today's video. The breaking point came when Elena discovered that the elementary school had not been properly evacuated, despite being directly in the path of the toxic plume. The school's administration had received conflicting information from emergency services, and the decision had been made to implement a shelter-in-place protocol rather than full evacuation. Elena's knowledge of chemical dispersal patterns and building ventilation systems told her that the school's air handling system would actually concentrate the toxic gases, turning the building into a death trap for over 300 children and staff members. Elena's knowledge of the specific details came from her access to public safety databases and weather monitoring systems, information that was theoretically available to library personnel for emergency planning purposes. But her ability to interpret the significance of atmospheric conditions, chemical dispersal patterns, and medical treatment protocols reflected expertise that no reference assistant should possess. The realization that she was potentially the only person in the area who had both identified the true scope of the emergency and understood the specific medical interventions required placed Elena in a position that she had hoped never to face again. She was confronted with the choice between maintaining her anonymity and potentially preventing a catastrophic loss of life that would include hundreds of children. Her decision to take direct action was influenced by memories of the soldiers she had treated in combat zones, men and women who had died because medical help had arrived too late or been inadequate for their injuries. Elena had sworn an oath to preserve life and prevent suffering, and that commitment transcended her current civilian status or her desire for anonymity. The plan she developed required Elena to access emergency communication systems that were normally restricted to trained emergency personnel. She would need to contact medical facilities directly, provide specific information about antidote requirements, and coordinate evacuations based on her analysis of the chemical dispersal patterns. The operation would require knowledge and capabilities that would be impossible to explain if she were discovered. Elena's preparation for this unauthorized intervention involved retrieving information from her apartment that she had hoped never to use again. Medical protocols for chemical casualty treatment, contact information for military medical facilities that maintained larger stocks of specialized antidotes, and communication codes that would allow her to reach emergency response coordinators, who had the authority to implement large-scale medical interventions. The psychological transformation that occurred as Elena prepared for action was profound and irreversible. The careful emotional controls that had allowed her to function as a reference librarian began to dissolve, replaced by the focused intensity that had once enabled her to save lives under the most extreme conditions. The quiet library worker was disappearing, replaced by the combat medic who had never really died, but had only learned to hide. As Elena made her final preparations for the mission that would expose the chemical emergency and likely end her anonymity, she reflected on the irony of her situation. Dr. Carradine's systematic campaign to diminish her authority and limit her responsibilities had created the very conditions that would force her to reveal capabilities that exceeded anything in his imagination. His harassment had pushed her into a corner where silence was no longer an option, where the choice was between maintaining her cover and preventing a disaster that could cost hundreds of lives. The afternoon air outside the library was crisp and clear, but Elena knew that invisible death was drifting toward the elementary school with each passing minute. She was about to embark on a mission that would test every skill she had developed during her military service. knowing that discovery would mean the end of the peaceful existence she had worked so hard to build. The reference librarian was about to become a weapon against bureaucratic incompetence and institutional failure. Dr. Carradine was about to learn that his greatest mistake had been underestimating the quiet woman who had spent months documenting his every move while preparing for the moment when her true capabilities would be revealed. Elena gathered her materials and prepared to leave the library, knowing that when she returned, everything would be different. The chemical emergency was escalating with each passing minute, and she was the only person in position to prevent a catastrophe that would haunt the community forever. The woman who had once been declared dead was about to prove that some people refuse to stay buried, especially when lives hang in the balance. The Millbrook Elementary School stood silent in the afternoon haze, its red brick facade concealing the growing danger that Elena alone had recognized. At 2:47 p.m., she approached the building's main entrance with purposeful strides, her library identification badge still clipped to her cardigan, but her demeanor transformed into something that commanded immediate attention. The crossing guard, Mrs. Patterson, noticed the change immediately. The quiet librarian, who usually walked past with downcast eyes, now moved with the confident urgency of someone accustomed to life-and-death situations. Elena's first action was to locate the school's principal, Dr. Susan Martinez, who was conducting a routine administrative meeting in her office, completely unaware that a toxic cloud was drifting steadily toward her building. The secretary, Janet Williams, looked up from her desk with the practiced smile reserved for community visitors, but her expression changed when she saw Elena's face. "Dr. Martinez," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority that had once coordinated medical evacuations under enemy fire. "I need to speak with you immediately about an emergency situation that requires your immediate attention." The principal emerged from her office with the cautious expression of someone who had learned to take unexpected visitors seriously, but she clearly didn't recognize the transformed woman standing before her. Elena's explanation of the chemical emergency was delivered with clinical precision that left no room for doubt or delay. The organophosphate release from the processing plant, the inadequate emergency response, the wind patterns that were carrying the toxic plume directly toward the school, each detail was presented with the expertise of someone who had dealt with chemical casualties in combat zones. Dr. Martinez's initial reaction was skepticism mixed with confusion about how a library worker had acquired such detailed knowledge of chemical emergencies. But Elena's description of the specific symptoms that would begin appearing in exposed individuals, the timeline for respiratory failure, and the medical interventions that would be required, convinced the principal that she was dealing with someone who possessed genuine expertise. The evacuation order that Elena recommended went far beyond the standard shelter-in-place protocol that the school had been following. She insisted that all students and staff needed to be moved to the high school gymnasium, located upwind from the chemical release, within the next 20 minutes. The evacuation would need to be conducted in a specific pattern that minimized exposure to the toxic plume, while ensuring that no one was left behind. Elena's knowledge of building ventilation systems became crucial as she explained why the school's air handling system would concentrate the organophosphate compounds rather than filtering them out. The very safety measures that the building had been designed to provide during emergencies would actually accelerate the chemical exposure, turning classrooms into gas chambers that would be fatal to anyone who remained inside. Dr. Martinez's decision to implement Elena's evacuation recommendations was made against the advice of district officials who were following standard emergency protocols. The principal had to choose between trusting the mysterious expertise of a library worker or following established procedures that might prove inadequate for this unprecedented situation. Elena's calm certainty and detailed knowledge of chemical casualties tipped the balance in favor of immediate action. The evacuation itself required Elena to coordinate with teachers, staff members, and volunteer parents who had arrived to help with the emergency. Her instructions were delivered with the same precision that had once characterized her medical briefings in combat zones, but she was careful to present her knowledge as research-based rather than experiential. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. The quiet librarian had become a crisis coordinator whose expertise exceeded that of the professional emergency responders. Elena's simultaneous coordination of medical preparations revealed the full extent of her capabilities. While directing the school evacuation, she was also contacting regional medical facilities to ensure they had adequate supplies of atropine and praladixime, the specific antidotes required for organophosphate poisoning. Her knowledge of dosage calculations, treatment protocols, and the critical timing factors that determine survival rates was far beyond what any civilian should possess. The first signs of chemical exposure appeared among the processing plant workers exactly as Elena had predicted. The symptoms began with excessive salivation and constricted pupils, followed by muscle twitching and respiratory distress that would progress to complete respiratory failure without immediate medical intervention. Elena's accurate prediction of the symptom timeline convinced emergency medical personnel that they were dealing with someone who understood chemical casualties at an expert level. Elena's direct intervention with the ambulance crews required her to reveal knowledge that would have been impossible to explain under normal circumstances. She provided specific instructions for treating organophosphate poisoning, including dosage calculations that needed to be adjusted for body weight and exposure duration. Her ability to assess the severity of chemical exposure by observing symptoms was so accurate that paramedics began requesting her evaluation of incoming casualties. The coordination with military medical facilities required Elena to use contact information and communication protocols that she had memorized during her service but had never expected to need again. The nearest Army Medical Center, located 40 miles away, maintained larger stocks of chemical antidotes and had personnel trained in treating mass casualty chemical emergencies. Elena's knowledge of military communication procedures allowed her to expedite the delivery of medical supplies that would otherwise have taken hours to coordinate. Dr. Carradine's arrival at the elementary school marked a turning point in Elena's exposure. The library director had been monitoring emergency communications and had become increasingly concerned about reports that his reference assistant was somehow involved in coordinating the emergency response. His appearance at the evacuation site was motivated by a mixture of professional concern and personal curiosity about how Elena had become so prominently involved in the crisis. Elena's interaction with Dr. Carradine in the midst of the emergency revealed the full extent of the transformation she had undergone. The quiet librarian who had endured months of systematic harassment was now coordinating a complex emergency response that involved multiple agencies, hundreds of people, and life and death decisions that required immediate action. Her expertise and authority were being acknowledged by emergency professionals who had initially dismissed her concerns. The director's attempt to assert his authority over Elena's actions was met with a response that shocked everyone present. Elena's voice, when she finally addressed him directly, carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had commanded respect in far more dangerous situations than a small-town emergency. Dr. Carradine, she said, her words cutting through the chaos of the evacuation with surgical precision. I'm currently coordinating medical treatment for organophosphate poisoning that will save lives if implemented correctly. Unless you have specific expertise in chemical casualty treatment, I suggest you step back and let qualified personnel handle this situation. The public nature of this exchange, witnessed by teachers, parents, and emergency responders, marked the beginning of Elena's complete transformation from invisible library worker to recognized crisis leader. The authority in her voice and the obvious deference she was receiving from medical professionals made it clear that she possessed expertise that far exceeded her official position. Elena's medical assessment of the first casualties confirmed the accuracy of her predictions about the chemical exposure. The plant workers who had received immediate treatment with the antidotes she had recommended were showing signs of recovery, while those who had been treated with standard protocols were experiencing worsening symptoms. The difference in outcomes provided undeniable evidence that Elena's expertise was literally saving lives. The evacuation of the elementary school was completed within 17 minutes, just as the toxic plume reached the building's air intake system. Elena's timing had been perfect, based on her calculations of wind speed, chemical dispersal patterns, and the building's ventilation characteristics. The empty classrooms that would have been filled with children were now contaminated with levels of organophosphate that would have been fatal to anyone present. Elena's coordination of the medical response required her to work directly with emergency room physicians who were treating the chemical casualties. Her knowledge of drug interactions, dosage adjustments, and the specific complications associated with organophosphate poisoning was so comprehensive that doctors began consulting her about treatment decisions. The transformation from library worker to medical advisor was happening in real time, witnessed by professionals who could appreciate the expertise she was demonstrating. The arrival of military medical personnel from the Army Medical Center created a new dynamic that would test Elena's ability to maintain her cover story. The military medics were trained in chemical casualty treatment and would immediately recognize the level of expertise she was demonstrating. Her interactions with these personnel would need to be carefully managed to avoid revealing her true background while still providing the coordination necessary to save lives. Elena's handling of the military medical team required her to walk a careful line between demonstrating necessary expertise and avoiding recognition by personnel who might have known her during her service. Her knowledge of military medical protocols and communication procedures was so ingrained that she had to consciously modify her language and approach to avoid triggering recognition from people who had worked with combat medics. The success of the evacuation and medical response began to attract attention from county and state emergency management officials who were trying to understand how a small-town library worker had become central to managing a major chemical emergency. Elena's accurate predictions, effective coordination, and obvious expertise were creating questions that she would soon be unable to answer without revealing aspects of her true background. Elena's management of the crisis reached its peak when she realized that the chemical release was larger than anyone had initially calculated. Her analysis of atmospheric conditions and dispersal patterns indicated that the contamination would affect a much wider area than emergency services had prepared for. The nursing home, the community center, and several residential neighborhoods were all in the path of the expanding toxic cloud. The expanded evacuation that Elena recommended required coordination with multiple agencies and the movement of hundreds of additional people to safe areas. Her ability to manage this complex operation while simultaneously coordinating medical treatment for casualties demonstrated capabilities that were impossible to explain through library science training or civilian experience. Elena's direct communication with state emergency management officials required her to present her analysis and recommendations to people who had the authority to implement large-scale evacuations and medical responses. Her credibility with these officials was based entirely on the five-point accuracy of her predictions and the success of her previous recommendations. But questions about her background and expertise were becoming increasingly difficult to deflect. The transformation of Elena's role from library worker to emergency coordinator was being observed by Dr. Carradine, who was struggling to reconcile the woman he had been systematically harassing with the expert professional who was now saving lives and commanding respect from emergency officials. The cognitive dissonance was forcing him to question his assumptions about Elena's capabilities and background. Elena's realization that her cover was becoming unsustainable was accompanied by the knowledge that the emergency was far from over. The chemical contamination would require ongoing medical monitoring, environmental cleanup, and community health assessments that would take weeks or months to complete. Her involvement in the crisis had made anonymity impossible, and she would need to prepare for the questions and investigations that would inevitably follow. The afternoon sun was setting over Millbrook as Elena continued coordinating the emergency response, knowing that each decision she made was bringing her closer to the moment when her true identity would be revealed. The quiet librarian who had processed overdue books that morning was now managing a crisis that would be remembered as one of the most successful emergency responses in the county's history. But Elena also knew that her success in saving lives would come at the cost of the peaceful existence she had worked so hard to build. The woman who had been declared dead was about to be very much alive in the public consciousness, and the questions that would follow would eventually lead to the truth about her past and the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her to this moment. The Millbrook Community Center had been hastily converted into a medical triage facility as Elena's predictions about the expanding chemical contamination proved devastatingly accurate. By 6:30 p.m., the building buzzed with the controlled chaos of emergency medicine as dozens of casualties streamed in from the affected neighborhoods. Elena moved through the makeshift medical station with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years managing mass casualty situations, her every action revealing depths of expertise that could no longer be concealed. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the emergency room physician who had driven from the county hospital, watched Elena with growing amazement as she conducted rapid medical assessments with accuracy that exceeded many trained emergency personnel. Elena's ability to identify the severity of organophosphate poisoning by observing subtle neurological symptoms, her knowledge of drug interactions that could complicate treatment, and her instinctive understanding of triage priorities marked her as someone with extensive medical training. The first critical moment came when Elena encountered Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman from the Pine Ridge nursing home who was experiencing severe respiratory distress from chemical exposure. The paramedics had initially classified her as a lower priority case, but Elena's assessment revealed that the woman's symptoms indicated a potentially fatal level of organophosphate absorption that required immediate intervention. Elena's treatment of Mrs. Henderson required her to demonstrate clinical skills that were impossible to explain through library science training. She calculated the precise dosage of atropine needed based on the woman's weight, medical history, and exposure duration, then administered the injection with the steady hands of someone who had performed similar procedures countless times under extreme conditions. The elderly woman's rapid improvement following Elena's intervention provided undeniable evidence of her medical expertise. Dr. Mitchell's decision to formally request Elena's assistance in treating casualties marked a crucial turning point in her exposure. The physician's public acknowledgement of Elena's medical knowledge created a situation where she could no longer deflect questions about her background or downplay her capabilities. The quiet librarian who had spent months hiding her expertise was now being asked to use her skills to save lives in full view of the entire community. Elena's coordination with the military medical team from Fort Carson required her to employ communication protocols and medical terminology that revealed her familiarity with military healthcare systems. Major Robert Stevens, the team leader, noticed Elena's instinctive use of military medical abbreviations and her knowledge of field treatment procedures that were specific to combat medicine. Her ability to anticipate the team's needs and provide relevant intelligence about casualties suggested experience that extended far beyond civilian emergency response. The arrival of Agent Patricia Williams from the FBI's Chemical Emergency Response team created a new level of scrutiny that Elena had been dreading. Federal involvement in the crisis meant that her actions would be documented, analyzed, and investigated by personnel with the resources and authority to uncover her true identity. Agent Williams' initial interaction with Elena was professionally cordial, but her questions about Elena's background and expertise were clearly part of a broader investigation into the emergency response. Elena's handling of Agent Williams required her to provide explanations for her knowledge that skirted the edge of truth without revealing classified information. Her claimed expertise in chemical safety came from extensive research and library science training in emergency information systems, explanations that were technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. The FBI agent's expression suggested that she found these explanations insufficient, but the ongoing crisis prevented immediate follow-up questioning. The discovery of additional casualties in the Riverside elementary school area forced Elena to make decisions that revealed the full extent of her tactical thinking and crisis management abilities. The school's maintenance staff had been trapped in the building's basement when the chemical plume reached the facility, and their rescue required knowledge of building systems, ventilation patterns, and hazardous material containment that exceeded anything a librarian should possess. Elena's rescue plan involved coordinating with firefighters, hazmat specialists, and medical personnel to create a safe corridor for evacuating the trapped workers. Her understanding of air pressure dynamics, chemical dispersal patterns, and respiratory protection requirements enabled her to design an approach that minimized exposure risk while ensuring rapid evacuation. The successful rescue operation demonstrated leadership capabilities that were impossible to explain through civilian experience. Dr. Carradine's confrontation with Elena at the height of the emergency response represented the culmination of months of systematic harassment meeting the reality of her extraordinary capabilities. The library director had been watching Elena's transformation with growing bewilderment and anger, unable to reconcile the woman he had been systematically diminishing with the expert professional who was now commanding respect from emergency officials. Elena, Dr. Carradine said, approaching her as she coordinated the treatment of a critically injured chemical worker, "I demand to know how you acquired this level of medical expertise. Your personnel file contains no indication of medical training, and your behavior today suggests knowledge that goes far beyond library science." The confrontation occurred in full view of emergency responders, medical personnel, and community members who had been observing Elena's expert handling of the crisis. Elena's response to Dr. Carradine's challenge was delivered with the calm authority that had once characterized her interactions with superior officers in combat zones. Her voice carried across the medical station with unmistakable confidence, creating a moment of silence among the assembled personnel who recognized they were witnessing something significant. "Dr. Carradine," Elena said, her words measured and precise, "I'm currently managing medical treatment for chemical casualties that will determine whether people live or die. This is not the time or place for personnel discussions. If you have concerns about my performance, I suggest you document them and address them through appropriate channels after this emergency is resolved." The public nature of this exchange, witnessed by federal agents, military personnel, and medical professionals, marked the complete transformation of Elena's status from subordinate library worker to acknowledged crisis leader. The authority in her voice and the obvious deference she was receiving from emergency professionals made it clear that she possessed expertise and experience that far exceeded her official position. Elena's medical treatment of the most severely affected casualties required her to use advanced trauma care techniques that were specifically associated with military medicine. Her knowledge of treating chemical weapons exposure, her familiarity with antidotes that were rarely used in civilian medicine, and her instinctive understanding of how to prioritize multiple critical patients revealed training that could only have been acquired through military service. The arrival of Colonel James Morrison from the Army Chemical Corps created the most dangerous moment for Elena's continued anonymity. Military personnel with experience in chemical warfare would immediately recognize the level of expertise she was demonstrating and would have the background knowledge to identify techniques that were specific to combat medical training. Elena's interactions with Colonel Morrison would need to be carefully managed to avoid recognition while still providing the coordination necessary to manage the crisis. Elena's coordination with Colonel Morrison required her to demonstrate knowledge of military chemical detection equipment, decontamination procedures, and medical protocols that were classified at various levels. Her familiarity with these systems was so comprehensive that she could anticipate equipment capabilities and limitations without apparent reference to technical manuals or briefing materials. The colonel's growing suspicion about Elena's background was evident in his increasingly specific questions about her experience and training. The successful identification of the specific organophosphate compound responsible for the contamination required Elena to use analytical skills that combined chemistry, toxicology, and medical knowledge in ways that suggested advanced scientific training. Her ability to correlate symptom patterns with specific chemical structures and predict the effectiveness of different treatment approaches demonstrated expertise that was impossible to acquire through civilian education or library research. Elena's management of the medical supply chain became crucial as the crisis expanded beyond the capacity of local medical facilities. Her knowledge of which hospitals maintained stocks of specialized antidotes, her understanding of military medical supply systems, and her ability to expedite the delivery of critical medications through emergency channels revealed familiarity with medical logistics that extended far beyond civilian experience. The media attention that began to focus on Elena's role in the emergency response created additional pressure for her to explain her expertise and background. Television reporters and newspaper journalists who had arrived to cover the chemical emergency were particularly interested in the librarian, who had somehow become central to managing the crisis. Elena's attempts to deflect media attention were becoming increasingly difficult as her prominent role made her impossible to ignore. Elena's realization that her cover was completely blown came when she overheard Agent Williams discussing her background investigation with Colonel Morrison. The FBI agent's preliminary research had revealed inconsistencies in Elena's employment history and educational background that suggested a carefully constructed false identity. The colonel's military perspective on her demonstrated capabilities was leading both investigators toward conclusions that would inevitably expose her true background. The psychological impact of Elena's exposure was profound and complex. The months of systematic harassment and professional diminishment had created psychological defenses that were now being stripped away by the recognition and respect she was receiving from emergency professionals. The validation of her expertise and the acknowledgement of her leadership capabilities triggered emotions that she had been suppressing since her decision to abandon her military identity. Elena's management of her own emotional response to the crisis required her to employ the same psychological techniques that had enabled her to function effectively in combat zones. The compartmentalization skills that had once allowed her to treat wounded soldiers while under enemy fire were now being used to manage the stress of exposure, while maintaining the focus necessary to save lives during the chemical emergency. The evening briefing that Elena conducted for emergency management officials represented the final phase of her transformation from anonymous library worker to recognized crisis expert. Her comprehensive analysis of the chemical release, her accurate predictions about contamination patterns, and her effective coordination of medical resources had established her credibility with officials who would ultimately determine how the crisis was managed and investigated. Elena's briefing included technical details about chemical dispersal modeling, medical treatment protocols, and environmental remediation requirements that demonstrated knowledge spanning multiple scientific disciplines. Her ability to synthesize information from chemistry, medicine, meteorology, and emergency management into actionable intelligence revealed analytical capabilities that suggested extensive training in crisis management and scientific analysis. The questions that followed Elena's briefing focused increasingly on her background and the source of her expertise. State emergency management officials, federal investigators, and military personnel all expressed curiosity about how a small town librarian had acquired the knowledge necessary to manage such a complex emergency. Elena's responses were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the scope of her demonstrated capabilities made her cover story impossible to sustain. The arrival of Elena's former commanding officer, Colonel Rebecca Torres, at the emergency command center created the moment that Elena had been dreading since the crisis began. The colonel's presence meant that Elena's military background would be exposed completely, ending any possibility of maintaining her civilian identity. Colonel Torres' recognition of Elena's medical techniques and crisis management approach would provide definitive proof of her true background and capabilities. Elena's final act of concealment came when she requested a private meeting with Colonel Torres before her identity could be revealed publicly. The conversation that followed would determine whether Elena's military service could be acknowledged without compromising classified operations or endangering other personnel who had served in similar capacities. The quiet librarian, who had spent months hiding from her past, was about to confront the reality that some identities cannot be abandoned when lives depend on the skills they represent. The chemical emergency that had begun as a routine industrial accident had become the catalyst for Elena's complete transformation from anonymous civilian to recognized expert. The woman who had been declared dead was very much alive, and her expertise had saved dozens of lives while exposing the truth about her extraordinary background. The crisis was far from over, but Elena's role in managing it had already changed. Everything about her future and the community's understanding of the heroes who walk among them in disguise. The community center had transformed into a battlefield command post as Elena's true identity became the subject of intense scrutiny from multiple federal agencies. Colonel Rebecca Torres stood in the doorway of the makeshift medical facility, her eyes scanning the room until they found Elena coordinating the treatment of a chemical casualty. The colonel's presence sent a ripple of tension through the assembled personnel, who sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Elena's recognition of her former commanding officer was immediate and visceral. The woman who had trained her, deployed with her, and ultimately signed the orders that had declared her dead was now standing 20 feet away, observing the careful anonymity that Elena had constructed being systematically demolished by the demands of the crisis. The psychological impact of this confrontation was profound, representing the complete collision of her abandoned military identity with her carefully constructed civilian life. Colonel Torres' initial assessment of the situation was conducted with the tactical precision that Elena remembered from countless mission briefings. The colonel observed Elena's medical technique, her coordination with emergency personnel, and her obvious authority over the crisis response. Within minutes, Colonel Torres had reached conclusions that would reshape everyone's understanding of the quiet librarian, who had somehow become central to managing a major chemical emergency. The private meeting that Elena requested with Colonel Torres took place in a vacant classroom at the rear of the community center, away from the federal investigators and media personnel who were increasingly focused on Elena's background. The conversation that followed would determine whether Elena's military service could be acknowledged without compromising classified operations or endangering other personnel who might be living under similar circumstances. Colonel Torres' opening statement revealed the complexity of Elena's situation and the broader implications of her exposure. Elena, your death was reported and processed through official channels 3 years ago. Your family buried in empty coffin, and your service record was classified at levels that most people will never see. The fact that you're alive and demonstrating capabilities that match your classified background creates problems that extend far beyond this chemical emergency. Elena's response reflected the psychological transformation that had occurred during the crisis. The months of systematic harassment and professional diminishment had prepared her for this moment of truth, when the skills and experience she had tried to hide would be revealed completely. Colonel, my identity was constructed to protect classified operations and provide psychological recovery after traumatic service. The chemical emergency forced me to choose between maintaining that cover and allowing people to die from inadequate medical treatment. The colonel's understanding of Elena's position was informed by her knowledge of the classified program that had created Elena's false death and civilian identity. The psychological casualties from Special Operations medical units had been so severe that the military had developed comprehensive programs to provide new identities and civilian careers for personnel who could no longer function in military environments. Elena's case represented one of the most successful transitions until the chemical emergency had forced her to reveal capabilities that shattered her carefully constructed anonymity. The investigation that would follow Elena's exposure involved multiple federal agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting priorities. The FBI's interest focused on the potential security implications of a presumed dead military medic living under a false identity. The Defense Department's concerns centered on protecting classified operations and maintaining the integrity of programs that provided cover identities for other personnel. The Department of Veterans Affairs needed to address the psychological and medical support requirements for someone whose official death had been reversed by public exposure. Elena's debriefing sessions with federal investigators revealed the full scope of her military background and the circumstances that had led to her civilian identity. The classified missions she had participated in, the medical techniques she had developed, and the psychological trauma that had necessitated her transition to civilian life were all documented in reports that would influence policy decisions about similar cases. Elena's experience would become a template for managing the exposure of other personnel who might face similar circumstances. The media attention that surrounded Elena's revelation created a public relations challenge that required careful management by multiple government agencies. The story of a presumed dead war hero who had been working as a librarian while enduring systematic harassment captured public imagination and generated intense interest in the programs that supported veterans with classified backgrounds. Elena's case became a symbol of hidden heroism and the importance of recognizing that exceptional capabilities might exist in unexpected places. Dr. Carradine's response to Elena's exposure was characterized by a combination of shock, embarrassment, and desperate attempts to justify his systematic harassment of someone whose actual capabilities far exceeded his own. The library director's campaign of professional diminishment was now publicly revealed as the petty persecution of a decorated combat veteran by someone who had never faced genuine danger or responsibility. His position became untenable as the community learned about his treatment of Elena during her months of anonymous service. The legal proceedings that followed Elena's exposure involved multiple jurisdictions and complex issues of federal law, veterans' rights, and workplace harassment. Dr. Carradine's systematic campaign against Elena was documented through the careful record she had maintained, providing evidence of institutional harassment that had targeted someone whose true background made his actions particularly egregious. The case would establish precedents for protecting veterans with classified backgrounds from discrimination and harassment. Elena's return to active consultation with military medical units represented a compromise that allowed her to contribute her expertise while maintaining the psychological stability that required civilian life. The Defense Department's recognition of her unique position led to the creation of a new category of veteran consultant that provided meaningful work while protecting the anonymity and civilian status that remained essential for psychological well-being. The transformation of Millbrook's emergency response capabilities reflected the lasting impact of Elena's crisis management during the chemical emergency. The community's experience with her expertise led to comprehensive improvements in emergency preparedness, medical response systems, and the recognition that exceptional capabilities might exist within seemingly ordinary community members. Elena's case became a model for identifying and utilizing hidden expertise. During crisis situations, the psychological impact of Elena's exposure extended beyond her personal experience to influence broader discussions about veteran transition programs and the challenges faced by military personnel with classified backgrounds. Her case highlighted the importance of providing comprehensive support systems that could protect veterans' identities while recognizing their continued value to national security and community safety. Elena's work with other veterans facing similar challenges became one of the most significant outcomes of her exposure. The network of support and advocacy that developed around her case provided resources and guidance for military personnel who needed to transition to civilian identities while maintaining their readiness to contribute specialized skills when circumstances demanded their involvement. The annual memorial service that had honored Elena's presumed death was transformed into a celebration of her survival and continued service to the community. The ceremony brought together military personnel, community members, and federal officials who had been involved in managing the crisis that had exposed her true identity. The event became a powerful symbol of the hidden heroes who serve in silence until circumstances require them to step forward. Elena's influence on military medical training programs reflected the broader impact of her case on defense policies and veteran support systems. The techniques she had developed, the crisis management approaches she had demonstrated, and the psychological resilience she had maintained became standard components of programs designed to prepare military medical personnel for both combat, service, and civilian transition. The elementary school that Elena had saved from chemical contamination was renamed in her honor, creating a permanent reminder of the librarian who had revealed herself as a guardian angel when the community needed her most. The school's dedication ceremony brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Elena's actions, providing public recognition of heroism that had previously been hidden behind the mask of ordinary civilian life. Elena's final public appearance as a librarian occurred during the ceremony that officially recognized her contributions to the community and her transition to a new role that acknowledged her true capabilities. Her speech to the assembled crowd reflected the transformation she had undergone from anonymous library worker to recognized expert, emphasizing the importance of recognizing hidden strengths and supporting those who serve in silence. The lasting legacy of Elena's case extended far beyond the immediate crisis that had exposed her identity. The policies that were developed, the support systems that were established, and the recognition that exceptional capabilities might exist in unexpected places would influence how communities and institutions identified and protected their most valuable resources. Elena's story became a reminder that heroes often hide in plain sight, waiting for the moment when their true capabilities would be revealed. 3 years after the chemical emergency, Elena Vasquez stood before the United States Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, delivering testimony that would reshape military policy and veteran support systems across all branches of the armed forces. Her prepared remarks addressed not only the specific circumstances of her case, but also the broader implications of supporting veterans whose classified backgrounds required ongoing protection and recognition. The woman who had once processed overdue books while enduring systematic harassment had become a nationally recognized advocate for veteran rights and military reform. Her transformation from anonymous librarian to policy expert demonstrated that the most powerful advocates for change often emerge from those who have experienced injustice and overcome it through courage and determination. Elena's story had proven that the most dangerous enemies of progress are those who underestimate the quiet strength of people who choose to serve their communities in whatever capacity circumstances require. Asterisk asterisk, if this incredible story of hidden heroism and ultimate justice inspired you, you're not alone. Thousands of viewers have found hope in these tales of ordinary people with extraordinary backgrounds who refuse to be broken by those who underestimate them. Have you ever encountered someone who seemed ordinary but possessed hidden depths of experience and capability? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire our next video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more amazing stories of courage, resilience, and the incredible people who walk among us disguised as everyday heroes. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone overlooks. Until next time, remember, never underestimate the quiet ones. They might just change your world when you need it most. Asterisk asterisk.